Be happy to share your screen, Rhys.
Okay, you've got that, Esther?
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay.
So welcome everyone to the final WISERD Lunchtime Seminar of 2020. And it's a good one. We've got Jenkins and Rhys Davies talking about lockdown in Bangalore, the vulnerabilities of Indian garment workers exposed by COVID-19. So we're going to hear from Jean and Rhys, and then there'll be time to ask questions and have a discussion afterwards. If you want to contribute or ask a question, you can do so in the chat, or you can click on participants and use the raise hand feature, and I'll remind you of that after the presentation. So yeah, let's welcome our speakers and let them get started.
Thanks, Esther. So I'm going to just introduce the first couple of slides, then I'm going to hand over to Rhys for the clever stuff, and then I'll come in at the end again. Rhys, could you move it on to the next slide? Thanks. Now, I think everybody's going to be fairly familiar with this project by now, but just to recap, the Operationalizing Labour Rights project is a project that we've been engaged in for almost 2 years now. And the aim was to compile a data bank of workplace grievances. The point of doing this is because typically workers on the ground and campaigners and activists, when they give evidence of transgressions on the ground and violations of labour rights, then what's said to them is, oh, well, this is one bad apple, this is one bad employer. It's not a general, it's not a general problem. And corporate social responsibility and the efforts of brands and employers together have basically solved all these problems. Now we know that that is not the case, and we structured this project around the language of the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So we're looking at the effectively the role of the state and corporation in providing access to remedy at the workplace level. And it's the workplace that's the most difficult place to get to. Nobody wants us to look at it. Nobody wants, when I say nobody, certainly employers don't want us to look at it. Brands don't want us to look at the workplace. And it is an extremely difficult place to get to. So this project was designed to provide an evidential base for advocacy in the field and with policymakers. And over the last 2 years, what we've been doing through field workers on the ground is compiling lists and explanations of grievances. So we have fairly detailed and rich accounts, both through survey data and interviews, of the conditions that workers deal with typically on a daily basis. And we're trying to monitor. One aspect of the research is to, and this is why it's good that it's over a lengthy period of time, is to see whether and how grievances can be resolved at the workplace, as employers claim, through internal grievance mechanisms. We haven't found that so far. So that's the project that took us to Bangalore. And if we move on to the next slide, just for me to explain what happened during, what has been happening during the pandemic. I did a fieldwork trip to Bangalore in January and returned in February, when there was talk of a pandemic, but to be honest, I wasn't taking it that seriously at that time. But it's really good that we did have that period of fieldwork because, of course, lockdown hit us all in March. And at that point, all our fieldwork had to stop for the OLR project. And we weren't completely sure about how we were going to deal with this, but everything was happening so quickly at the time that we knew that our field workers were continuing to interact with workers remotely. But the lockdown occurred with hours of notice. So bearing in mind that the workers that we are researching with, they're on poverty pay anyway. They buy their food every night as they go home after the working day. They don't have the type of homes where you can store food. They don't have the sort of facilities where you can stockpile anything. They also don't have the sort of housing where you can socially distance from one another. I mean, I go into workers' homes and people are living very, very close together. These workers aren't able to prepare for lockdown, even if they'd had notice, even if they'd had a week's notice, they couldn't have prepared for the lockdown in terms of staying in their homes and stockpiling food. But what they could have done is they could have traveled home to their villages. Because lockdown was imposed so quickly, what these workers found themselves, the situation these workers found themselves in was that there were no buses, there were no trains. They were in their houses, still being required to pay rent, and with no income. So they were immediately thrown into destitution. And over the in the weeks immediately, in the days immediately following lockdown, what the team in Cardiff did in conjunction with the team in Bangalore for this, we have to thank Katie Dixon, Helen Blakely, and Rhys. He's too modest to claim any kudos for this, but it was a very quick and very it was a huge contribution to adapt our normal survey tool to identify and facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to workers in need, because workers were continuing to contact our field workers, because our field workers are grassroots trade unionists. So they were still being contacted, not to do with our project, but to do with requests for help and support. So a slimmed down version of the OLR survey was done in very, very short time. And that survey then helped to, that tool helped to identify workers, take details from them that allowed them to gain food and allowed us to analyze the data. So the data that Rhys is going to explain was taken mainly between the 27th of April and the 29th of June. Around 700 workers contacted our field workers, and I'll hand over to Rhys now to explain the data that's been collected.
Okay, thank you, Jean. So just to put our data collection into a bit of context, in the context of the wider OLR study, this slide just shows how the responses that we were getting to both the OLR survey and the COVID survey over the last couple of years. So as Jean alluded to, the OLR study was taking place before the lockdown, and you can see there with those blue bars that our fieldwork for that began in during a pilot phase in early 2019, and we were getting a steady number of responses being recorded by our colleagues in Bangalore right up until the onset of the pandemic. And then you can see there how our OLR responses then came to a halt in March 2020, and it took us about 4 weeks during the initial period of the lockdown to construct a slimmed down version of the OLR survey, our COVID survey. So as you can see there with the orange bars, we achieved about 700 responses during a 10-week period from the 27th of April to the 29th of June, which represented the kind of the height of the lockdown in Bangalore. So the survey took place, the COVID survey took place for a duration of about 10 weeks. Then as things, well, I can't say begin to get back to normal, but when it became possible for the OLR survey to then recommence, we reverted back to our usual methods of data collection in the autumn time, the end of this summer for a few months. Data collection on the OLR study has now also come to an end. So I'll be talking to you about the data that we collected, represented by those orange bars, during 10 weeks, end of April to the end of June this summer. Just so you can get an idea of where we're talking about. So our study is based in the city of Bangalore, which is in the area of Karnataka in India. So you can see that on the map there. In terms of the respondents to the kind of COVID-19 survey, a majority of them are garment workers and are female, 91%. They don't tend to be born in Bangalore. They tend to come from the wider district of Karnataka and some beyond. But as Jean mentioned earlier on, in terms of the people who responded to our COVID-19 survey, or the workers who contacted our colleagues in Bangalore and whose details were recorded, 94% were living in Bangalore during the lockdown. Only 5% had left Bangalore and got in touch with our colleagues in Bangalore remotely from outside of the Bangalore district. We'll go on now to the characteristics of these workers who were responding to our survey. As I mentioned, a majority of our respondents are female, but we did have some male respondents, so we are able to compare and contrast the circumstances of the male garment workers and female garment workers who reported their circumstances to our colleagues in Bangalore. And I think an interesting aspect of this slide is quite often in Bangalore that employers almost dismiss the work of the female workers in terms of the importance of their income. They regard it as generally as being a second income in the household. And this slide clearly demonstrates that that is not the case. Both male and female garment workers are living with either their immediate or extended family, particularly in the case of female garment workers, where 92% are living with their either immediate or extended family. And in terms of the people who are dependent upon their income, the female garment workers are in particularly more likely to say that their children are dependent upon their income alongside their spouse. So their income is making a very important contribution to the household. It's not merely a second income as the employers would often like to portray that it is. Yes, it can be seen that amongst the male workers who got in touch with our colleagues in Bangalore, they report having responsibilities in terms of supporting their wider family members as well, their parents and their in-laws and their siblings. But clearly you can see that the household is very dependent upon the income that is generated, that is earned by these female garment workers. And in terms of where these workers are living, well, they are living, like I say, with their immediate extended family, and they're living in homes that they generally rent. So any disruption to the income, their income is going to have immediate consequences in terms of their ability to pay for their accommodation needs. So the lockdown in Bangalore commenced in India, in March the 24th. And on March 29th, the government ordered landlords not to demand rent from their tenants. And they also ordered employers to pay wages for the remainder of March without any deductions. So even though the month of March was cut short by the pandemic, employers were ordered to pay wages for the full month to their workers. Well, our COVID survey demonstrates that this did not happen on the ground. We can see that in the column where it says received payment for wages during March, 9% of our workers received nothing, and 38% only received payment in part for March. So 53%, only just over half of workers received payment in full. There's problems here also, though, because there is a practice in the garment sector in Bangalore called comp-off, where if work is disrupted, the workers may still be paid, but they are essentially asked to earn that money back in the future. Their time is banked in the future. So this is an illegal practice. It's an unlawful manipulation of workers' time. So what we can actually see here, that even amongst those who are paid in full for the month of March, among that 52-53%, 1 in 5 of those workers, their employers had told them that their payment for the extra week in March was to be expected to be covered by annual leave or comp-off. And in fact, in the majority of cases, this week that they were paid for where they weren't able to work, the employers are expecting them to work that back at a future date. And that is an unlawful practice. In terms of working during the lockdown, in the weeks, months that followed, only about a quarter of our workers were asked by their employer to work during the lockdown, and as a result of that, about a fifth actually did work. Women were much more likely to be asked to work during the lockdown than their male colleagues, and more women actually did work during the lockdown than their male colleagues. I'm not sure for the reasons behind this. Jean might want to come in on this later on, but it could be possibly due to the occupation. The differences between male and females, or it could be issues around the exertion of power. Jean might want to say something about that later on. In a majority of cases, those who are working, they do say that they are working to make protective equipment for healthcare workers. 3/4 of those who are working during the lockdown are making protective equipment for healthcare workers. Amongst those who have been working during the lockdown months, again, only a minority have been paid for their work, either in part or in full. Almost half of workers there say that they've received nothing for their work during the months that they were working, during the period they were working in the lockdown. The overwhelming concern of these workers is simply in terms of making ends meet. The lockdown has obviously caused a significant disruption to their earning, their income. And when we asked about what concerns they had regarding the accommodation and what increasing concerns they had in light of the pandemic, an overwhelmingly large majority, almost all, said that they're concerned about the ability to pay rent. But as Jean mentioned earlier on also, these workers are living in very, very poor quality accommodation, very overcrowded accommodation, very unhygienic accommodation with poor levels of amenities and facilities. And we can see in this slide here that although their overwhelming concern is actually being able to pay their rent, across the board, workers were also expressing concerns with their accommodation in terms of overcrowding, hygiene, and of the amenities and facilities that were available to them. So COVID-19 is highlighting the poor conditions under which these workers are living. You'll also see there that these workers are concerned about harassment, intimidation. So this is obviously going to be from landlords seeking rent. And of course, the Indian government did say that landlords should not be pursuing their tenants for rent during this period, but clearly workers are concerned about this. And this is clearly demonstrated in this slide where, like I said earlier on, this survey took place over the course of 10 weeks during the lockdown. And we can see that during this 10-week period, there is an increasing concern expressed on the part of workers in terms of being fearful of intimidation and harassment. So they are increasingly worried about the intimidation and harassment that they are going to receive from their landlords during the course of the lockdown, to the extent that by the end of our COVID-19 data collection period, so towards the end of June, almost a third of workers expressed concerns about intimidation and harassment in relation to their accommodation. The COVID-19 study also asked workers about their access to the necessities of life, we've labelled in this chart. And again, here you can see on this chart that the overwhelming concern is about the workers saying that they don't have sufficient access to money to pay for their rent. Other concerns are clearly labelled there around food and gas in particular. We're also able again to paint the picture of a deteriorating situation in Bangalore during this time, particularly with respect to access to hygiene products and sanitary products, where you can clearly see that in between May and June, an increasing proportion of workers saying that they have insufficient access to soap and sanitary products, for example. They're also expressing concerns regarding access to medicines, and clearly there between May and June, there's an increased proportion of workers who say that they don't have sufficient access to medicines, increasing from 50% to 61%. So clearly here across many of these necessities of life, there is a picture there, the survey is painting a picture of the deteriorating situation in Bangalore during this 10-week period. Finally, I'll talk about access to supplies and medicines briefly. Workers are mostly reliant upon local shops for obviously gaining access to their supplies, but government distribution centres also came into play during the lockdown period, and they were an important source of access to food and drinking water and so forth. ESI hospitals, well, this is the employee state insurance scheme in India. So these are, publicly state-run hospitals and dispensaries. And there is a long-standing problem with access to these facilities for garment workers. And we see that during the lockdown, almost half of workers say that their state-funded healthcare is not accessible to them. Those who said that it wasn't accessible to them, we asked why not. There are reasons related to employment, the ESI record not being up to date and no ESI card. Employers do not have a great record at maintaining records within the workplace sufficient for workers to have an ESI card. Employers may not have paid the contributions that they were expected to make in order for workers to gain access to these kinds of facilities. There's also practical issues, and that even though these ESI facilities, will be dotted around Bangalore, workers who don't have access to public transport, and of course much public transport was no longer accessible during the lockdown period, and also so they won't be able to get to these facilities. Of course, so the workers may also be ill also and too unwell in order to access these facilities. So here we have a picture of workers who are in need of medical care being unable to access it during the period of the lockdown. Okay, that's the run through the data. So I'll now pass you back to Jean, who can help to tell us what it all means.
Just one thing, Rhys, before we move on, could you just go back to the necessities of life graph just for 1 second?
Okay, I'm trying to.
One slide, 2 slides back.
Yeah, I'm trying to go back one slide here. You have to come out and.
Oh, don't worry, don't worry. It's okay. I can just say it. It was about on the necessities of life graph. You also saw phone top up. That's not a frivolous thing. Since Modi has tried to make India more and more a cashless society, a lot of workers can't access bank accounts and get access to their money without access through their phones. So having a working phone is a lifeline. So the implications of what we see in what Rhys has outlined here is that essentially it highlights how precarious the lives of these workers are. The work that they're doing is not sustainable. It's not sustainable work. What this work does in global supply chains all around the world is, yes, it increases economic activity, particularly of women, but it doesn't give them work that allows them to accumulate even the smallest degree of personal wealth. What happens is they get access to credit because they are seen to be working, and they get access to local credit. But this is the type of work which embeds workers in debt. And some of the harassment around accommodation would undoubtedly, we don't have this evidence, but I'm sure that some of the harassment around rents would be landlords demanding sexual favors in return for non-payment of rent, as well as just straightforward demands for money. So these workers are on the edge of destitution at normal times. They are the working poor. And they're contributing to an international supply chain which works on this basis. It exploits labor in order to make its profits in a business model which is devoid of any morality, I would say. I would say that. It's a toxic business model. So as factories have reopened, I mean, there is scope to investigate more about what's going on in the factories, and the resumption of our OLR survey will give us some insight into what's happening since the factories have reopened. But our understanding is that the picture is very mixed. Social distancing is probably not happening. Safety conditions are probably not being well observed. It will be possible for us to compare pre and post COVID data in the OLR survey to see whether we can identify any distinctive features of social relations on the factory floor post lockdown. We haven't actually engaged in that analysis yet, but what's very, very clear, even at this point, is that working conditions are going to come under more strain. There is there is some evidence that employers were selectively re-employing. So, for example, anyone with open connections with trade unions was less likely to be re-employed than somebody that somebody that didn't. So it's not a good picture. It's a very challenging picture for an industry that already doesn't have a good record for working conditions. So we can move to the next slide, Rhys. So this phrase, building back better, I mean, this is what we would all like to hope for. And I confess to being one of the people that was very hopeful at the beginning, that, at the beginning of this whole pandemic, that the world might be a better place coming out of it, that we would reject these models of exploitation and try and have a sort of new Green Deal, or at least a New Deal worldwide. But I don't think my hope is being eaten away, really, because what we see happening on the ground suggests that things are there are major battles ahead. So in India, in particular, changes in trade union law and employment law have come in. They were already planned before the pandemic, but they're now effective and have increased the challenges for trade unions immensely. I can just give you one example. In order to gain a collective bargaining agreement before these law changes, a trade union had to prove 30% membership in a factory. They now have to prove 70% union membership. in a factory in order to be able to claim the right to collective bargaining. Internationally, the market is also deeply unfavorable. So brands, that's talk about the state and changes in the law. In terms of brands and corporations and employers on the ground have been caught in a very, very difficult situation where brands not only cancelled orders that were, due to go into production, but also those in progress and completed work. So they refused to accept completed work as well. And I mean, we can see recessionary pressures here in the UK, but the failure of groups like Arcadia and others are going to signal a change in the sector. Yeah, a change in the sector. So we can go on to the next slide where we talk about some of these changes. While the failure of groups like Arcadia, while the behavior of Western brands is very, very concerning, there are also other things happening in the garment sector. So there's a considerable growth in South-South trade. It's no longer accurate to think of Western brands and global South producers. This is much more widely dispersed. Production is much more widely dispersed. It's coming into, Eastern Europe is a very, very big site of production. And we see the rise of large Asian manufacturers, Greater China, from Greater China in particular, who are looking, they're not brands, but they are, giant firms, and they are looking for cheaper locations to locate their manufacturing. So as we look forward, the cost of labor remains crucial at the local level. And just to give you an example of an initiative by the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is one of the states in India that took a lead right after the pandemic and cancelled all labor law for 1,000 days. That's 3 years. And the reasoning there was that this cancellation of labor law would make the workforce more flexible and attractive for investors. So, if that's the solution to recession, then labor once again is likely to be sacrificed to the market. And when we look at that sort of example, we know that building back better is going to be a fight. Workers are going to have to continue to struggle for their rights, continue to struggle for basic international standards to be implemented throughout the supply chain. And they're going to have to struggle continually against entrenched vested interests. So our COVID data illustrates, how vulnerable these workers are, and the research that is, or the evidence that's emerging from the ground suggests that post-COVID, workers are going to have just as big, if not a bigger, struggle to survive and prosper in their lives. And that's where we end, really, unfortunately. I don't think we have another slide, do we, Rhys?
No, that's it.
No.
Well,
I think, as usual, I end on a depressing note. But having said that, workers are organising, workers are carrying on. Our field workers are back at work as grassroots activists. They've been working remotely, and they're continuing to work remotely. But the fight goes on, and in that fight there's hope. But it is a fight.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Rhys. That was really interesting and thought-provoking. So I'm going to open up for questions. Does anybody have a question? You can, Alan, straight in there.
Got to unmute myself. Oh, thanks a lot for that. It was very, very depressing, I have to say, but extremely interesting and a great presentation, as I'd expect, of course, from both you two. I've got two questions. The first question is a technical one, and it's my ignorance. What is OLR? You keep mentioning the OLR survey. That's one question. Can I just then say the other question? That's a small question. A bigger question is, how do these results compare with non-garment sector workers? What I'm interested in here is, are these issues particular to garment workers or a general issue? And the reason I'm saying that is you gave examples of changes to labour law, which don't apply to just garment workers, they apply generally. So my question is, it's a dire picture, but in terms of calibrating that, is it the fact that garment workers in particular are more kind of disadvantaged than other garment workers, because the things that are at state level coming in apply to the labour market generally?
Can I answer? Should I answer that, Rhys?
Yes, please, Jean. Yeah.
Yeah. So OLR is just it's the title that we gave to our project, Operationalizing Labour Rights. So sorry for that, Alan. Perhaps I didn't explain that at the beginning, but it's just our shorthand for a cumbersome title, really. In terms of garment workers are in the hierarchy of exploitation. They're not too badly off in India. Construction workers, domestic servants will be far worse off. Day labourers will be far worse off. So what we're looking at here is not the worst picture, and the conditions apply across the board.
Just to add to that, to Jean's comments, Alan, the survey did include some respondents from domestic workers and some respondents from construction workers. Our colleagues in Bangalore, where these workers expressed, their needs, were in need of support. Our colleagues in Bangalore, although they were based primarily in the garment sector, they still listened to these workers and took their details down. So we do have some responses in the COVID survey from non-garment workers, and we could perhaps look at some indicative results there, but there's not large numbers to present on tables like this.
Could I also say, Alan, the March 2020 mistake, which you pointed out in chat, is my mistake, not Rhys's. I don't know what year I'm in anymore. Sorry.
Sorry, I just thought, gosh,
no,
have I missed a year? Have I missed a year?
No,
I thought it was a typo.
Yeah,
it's a typo.
Thank you very much. I think I've done that in almost every presentation I've done. So I'm going to have to go back now and try and change the science. Sorry.
You do forget what year it is, I have to say. I almost forget what day it is, of course, as well, but there we go.
Thank you, Alan. I think we've got a question from Ian up next. I can see your hand raised, Ian.
Hi, Rhys and Jean, thank you so much. I know it was depressing, but it's also really important. I was really interested in what you were saying about the kind of cashless imperative. I know Modi had tried to extend his policies on this for a number of years now. And I was just wondering whether you had, and I'm sorry I had to go out for 5 minutes because the dog was barking, so you might have said this, but is there a sense, or do you have a sense that people are becoming increasingly indebted, and this debt is being facilitated by this push towards cashlessness?
Well,
so
I know
it's easier for the employers to kind of get people into debt because of the push for cashlessness.
I don't think we have direct evidence on that, but one thing that I do know from our interviews in the field and more from our interviews in the field is that people are very often working 3 months in arrears of wages. Typically, factories will pay 6 weeks in arrears. And so workers are going into debt. But debt, they can't survive without debt. And that's why when you see arbitrary factory closure, the distress is so great, because workers may have been surviving for a long time without wages, and then the factory owner closes down and goes away without severance payments, and they're left without wages. I mean, we did have in when I was there in January, there was one case where the workers not kidnapped, but locked the manager inside the factory until they got their pay. Yeah, he was in there for a week with the workers, you know, and they refused to let him go. But indebtedness is, I mean, it's the way all these workers survive. In terms of the cashless society, I don't know whether there is a direct link with that, but I do know that there was the most immense distress through this cashless policy. And it's more and more difficult for workers to access their money without some form of electronic access.
Thank you.
Go on, Sally.
Yeah, I've got a thought and then a question. And I just wondered, the thing about these desperate times and a cashless society is it makes people want to gamble, because it's perhaps the only way out. And we know, particularly in India, there's a huge illegal gambling thing, isn't there? And I'm sure you don't have data on it, but I do wonder whether the move towards cashless things increases the vulnerability of very vulnerable people to online gambling. So it's just a thought. But the other question I was going to ask was about, is there any movement, a sort of cooperative movement, sort of trying to appeal to the sort of Waitrose type consumer in the West? I mean, is there some kind of self-organizing, and I know not probably amongst your respondents, but more generally in India, even if it's not a huge kind of, it's not going to affect global change, is there some form of sort of cooperative alliance?
Sorry, Rhys, am I jumping in?
No, carry on, Jean, please.
There are movements. There are also there are movements, not in our data. There are movements, but there are also government training schemes. The issue is that the corruption of these schemes is considerable. So personally, unless I knew the cooperative, I would never buy from a cooperative in India. Unless I knew them personally, I wouldn't, because there have been a lot of maybe well-meaning but misguided initiatives where workers have been brought in from the countryside into trained and then brought into so-called cooperatives. And they're undercutting workers in other employment, and it's not, and also they're not necessarily free to leave. So it's complicated. And on the gambling issue, I mean, one thing which is typical in visiting workers' homes and seeing them in their own communities is that, unfortunately, and I don't mean this as a generalization, but there's a huge problem of alcoholism among men. When you do visit somebody's home, you are likely to have to deal with a man who has some sort of problem with addiction of that nature, and so I would expect that those same men are also gambling in some way or other, as an outlet, as some form of hope. I don't know. I shouldn't generalize. I'm not saying all all husbands of Indian garment workers are alcoholic, but if you speak to anybody in Bangalore, they will tell you quite openly that there is a big problem with alcoholism among men in particular areas of work, and that those particular areas of work are likely to be men that are more likely to be married garment workers.
Are there any other questions that people would like to ask? I wanted to ask about the collapse of Arcadia and whether that makes any kind of, whether the end point of the supply chain makes any tangible difference to the circumstances of garment workers. If will they just be shifting to supplying other mainly online retailers? Will that change anything?
Well, yeah, that's a big problem, because online retailers like Boohoo, Misguided, people like that, they are not producing in India. They're producing in Leicester. They're producing in locations much closer to market, and they have very, very short runs, very short notice for their, they can go from design to finished garment in 2 weeks, and that's what they expect. So a move to online shopping will change the structure of the industry, and not for the better. So Arcadia, the brands in Arcadia didn't have a good reputation for honouring contracts and things, and paying their suppliers fairly anyway. The move to online shopping is a further risk. And when I was in Bangalore in January, we passed a lot of factories, even then, before the pandemic, that were being closed and being sold for real estate. This industry is like a locust. It's constantly on the move. It settles, it devours, and then it moves on. And the industry was already on the move. It's changing. But the fight back is there. So we mustn't lose hope.
Thanks, Jean. I can see Alan's raised his hand again, so we'll go back to Alan.
Okay, I just, because nobody else is asking a question, I thought I'd ask another one if I may. You didn't explain it, but I'm intrigued by it. The figures, the OLR survey had not many respondents, basically. There were, compared to the COVID survey, which was 700. So hence, how did you get such a high response to the COVID survey and such a low response to the OLR? And I suppose a follow-up question to that is, knowing that, would you persist with the method you used for the COVID survey instead of the OLR?
Thank you, Alan. We call the OLR survey a survey, but that's probably not the best way to describe it. Yes, both of these surveys, they were recorded on Lime Survey, courtesy of our fantastic colleague Katie Dixon, who helped set these things up. But the OLR survey was a much more in-depth, detailed data collection exercise. In fact, to call it it was inputted into a survey tool, but actually the data was collected really via case notes. And not only is the survey data from the OLR survey, yes, you do have the numerical coded up responses, but each of those surveys are accompanied by detailed case notes, which required translation into English to facilitate further analysis. So really the OLR study, or the data collection, it's actually both quantitative and qualitative data, and the resources surrounding the collection of that data were far greater. In moving to the COVID survey, yes, all the qualitative material, all the textual information that was being collected by Lime Survey was stripped out completely, purely for the purposes of designing a tool that could be administered remotely. Of course, we weren't able to have face-to-face contact with the workers for the COVID survey, so it was a much more streamlined tool that, like I say, did away with the qualitative information. So we weren't asking our colleagues in Bangalore to go through translation exercises. In terms of the legacy of the project, though, they actually the COVID survey, obviously, it's a much slimline version, much easier to administer, collected much more data. So in terms of the legacy of the the OLR project, and in terms of what data collection instruments we might leave with colleagues in Bangalore to work with moving forwards, so that there is a legacy to this study. I suspect, and we, as a team, we suspect that that's something that we do leave behind for colleagues in Bangalore to take forward will more closely resemble the COVID survey, a much more lighter touch data collection instrument that our colleagues in Bangalore will be able to take forwards on their own.
And just one, I mean, we're currently in discussion with on another potential project for Pakistan, where the original OLR survey style tool may be adapted for new purposes again. So yeah, it's
the only thing I would say is I don't know, I feel a bit uncomfortable with the use of the word survey, because you've explained it and it isn't. It's more than that. So I don't know whether you want to revisit that, because hence you're going to question, you're going to get a question from people like me saying, well, it's actually, you know, it's not really a survey as you've explained. So a data resource or something which I think is more appropriate than a survey. And yours, because it's different, very different actually. There are other questions I think about surveys. Is for me, it's you know, who fills them in, who's, and then the same goes to your data resource. To be honest, you could. So let me be an employer and say, be a devil's advocate. Well, you're collecting this data from the most the disenchanted. They're the people that are going to fill it in, not those that are kind of happy. I mean, sorry, that's I'm not saying that, but that's a kind of a retort you might get. And certainly with an online survey, which I think is what you're talking about, that's the tendency that certainly I found in the UK. They are a very different composition of respondents.
I think that's a really valid comments, Alan. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any further questions before we wrap up for 2020? I can't see any hands up. So I just want to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to Bauer, to Jean and to Rhys, and to Chloe for organising such a great series of seminars during the pandemic. We're back on the 12th of January for the start of a new year of lunchtime seminars. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Esther. Thanks, Jean.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.